Alright, so this week we turn more towards the belief aspect of knowledge. Knowledge as justified, true belief. Justified, true belief. We've done the truth part with Plato and Aristotle primarily, then moved on to post-truth. Talked about justification with logic and Descartes and Locke and Hume and Berkeley and Kant and what counts as justification, and what about personal experience, and what about other people's experiences and communal experiences and all of that stuff, what counts as justification. And so now we're going to turn towards belief, and it will get to be about God, sort of. When you hear the word belief, typically that also relates to the belief about the existence of God or not. But this isn't going to turn into a religion class suddenly. This is still philosophy. So it seems that philosophy is really trying to answer the question, does God exist? Question mark. The end. That's where it stops. Right? Is there an entity that, for Berkeley, is eternally perceiving? For Aristotle, who gets the whole ball of existence rolling, not really worrying about other attributes at this point, right? The philosophical question is there a God or gods? Fine. Religion then comes in with, well, if God does exist, then this is the one or the ones, and this then is our relationship to that thing or to those things. Those are the comparative religion questions, not the philosophy questions. But it is interesting to look at how we use the word belief, right? Many God-believing people consider themselves to be believers, which is interesting when you consider that belief is a part of knowledge, right? So if the God-believer is going to claim that there actually, in reality, truly is a God or a series of gods out there, that's true, and that they have good justification for it, namely an argument, and that's what we're going to be looking at is arguments, right? Remember, an argument's a list of premises followed by a conclusion. The only difference now is the conclusion will be, and therefore God exists. If it's true, and they're justified in their belief that it's true, and they happen to believe it's true, why not call themselves knowers instead of believers? That frequently when we think about the term belief, we think about belief in things that don't actually exist. Do you believe in the tooth fairy? Do you believe in the tooth fairy? Do you believe in Santa Claus, right? Because those things are not actually true. So regardless of your justification for your belief, you have nothing beyond justified belief. You cannot know it because it is not true. So it seems odd then that God believers use the phrase believer instead of knower, but that's a bit of a side note. We'll be looking at some God-believing folks, and they'll be giving us arguments to prove the existence of God, right? So they're still doing justification and truth. Belief is up to us. They can't give us belief. All they can do is give us good reasons to believe. That's it. And what's interesting is that the non-God-believing folks, which we'll also look at, they don't give arguments in support of the non-existence of God. And we've talked before about how difficult it would be to prove non-existence, that you either prove existence or existence isn't proven, which again doesn't prove the opposite. It doesn't prove that God doesn't exist. It merely proves that you don't have very good proof for the existence of God. So what I think is interesting is I found this book. It's a kid's book, of course, because that's all I read anymore, called Yellow and Pink. It's by the same guy who wrote Shrek, William Steig, or Steig, I'm not sure how you pronounce his name, S-T-E-I-G. And this particular book kind of tries to do the positive philosophy, the list of premises followed by a conclusion for there isn't God. And we'll see that it runs into the same problems that any proof for the existence of God will run into. That neither one of them is any more ridiculous than the other. And typically the non-God believing folks do the defense attorney thing. They merely poke holes in the premises, which then calls the conclusion into question, which again doesn't prove the non-existence of God. It just calls into question the conclusion that God exists. Okay. So Yellow and Pink. I'll start here. I don't know how close to get so you can see the pictures here. I guess we'll go here. Two small figures made of wood were lying out in the sun one day on an old newspaper. One was short, fat, and painted pink. The other was straight, thin, and painted yellow. It was hot and quiet, and they were both wondering. After a while, the yellow one sat up and focused his gimlet eyes on the pink one. "Do I know you?" he asked. "I don't think so," Pink answered. "Do you happen to know what we're doing here?" asked Yellow. "No," said Pink. "I don't even remember getting here." "Me neither," said Yellow, looking all around. There were chickens busy pecking a little way off, and farther back in the field some dreamy cows. "I can't help wondering," he went on, "how we got to be here. It all seems new and strange. Who are we?" The great philosophical question, right? It's interesting how that's tied to their history. How did we get here? Where are we now? Who are we? Right? Remember, that was part of Ayn Rand's point in her commencement speech at West Point in '74. Pink looked Yellow over. He found Yellow's color, his well-chiseled head, his whole form admirable. "Someone must have made us," he said. "How could anyone make something like me, so intricate, so perfect?" Yellow asked. "Or for that matter, like you. And wouldn't we know who made us, since we had to be there when we got made? And why," Yellow added, "would he leave us like this with no explanation? I say we're an accident. Somehow or other, we just happened." Pink couldn't believe what he heard. He started laughing. "You mean these arms I can move this way and that? This head I can turn in any direction, this breathing nose, these walking feet, all of this just happened by some kind of fluke? That's preposterous." "Don't laugh," said Yellow. "Just stop and reflect. With enough time, 1,000, 1,000,000, maybe 2.5 million years, lots of unusual things could happen. Why not us?" "Because it's impossible. It's absolutely out of the question. How could we just happen? Would you mind explaining?" Yellow got up and began pacing. He kicked a pebble aside. "Well, it could be something like this. I'm not saying exactly. Suppose a branch broke off a tree and fell on a sharp rock in just the right way so that one end split open and made legs. So there you have legs. Then winter came, and the piece of wood froze, and the ice split the mouth open. And there's your mouth. Then maybe one day a big hurricane took that piece of wood and sent it tumbling down a rocky hill with little bushes, and it got bumped and chipped and brushed and shaped this way and that. Sand blowing in the wind might have helped with the smoothing. That piece of wood could have hung around at the bottom of the hill for eons until one day, zing! Lightning struck in such a way as to make arms, fingers, and toes. All right, Pink interrupted. What about eyes? What about ears? What about nostrils? Yellow sat down on a stone to do more thinking. I appreciate how he's in Rodin's thinker pose or close to it. Eyes, he said, could have been made by insects boring in, or by woodpeckers. Maybe even by hailstones of exactly the right size, hitting repeatedly in just the right places. Said Pink. He clasped his hands behind him. How come we came to see out of those holes the woodpecker made, and hear? Because that's what eyes and ears are for, dummy. What else would you do with them? Those cows over there see with their big eyes. This ant sees with his teeny eyes. We see with ours. Okay, said Pink, let's say you're right, just for the sake of conversation. Do you mean to tell me all those odd things happened not only once, but twice, so that there's two of us? The branch fell off the tree, it hit the rock, it rolled down the hill, lightning struck, the woodpecker pecked, etc., etc.? Why not, said Yellow. In 1,000,000 years, I didn't say 5 seconds. The same thing could easily happen twice over. 1,000,000 years takes a very long time. Branches do break, winds are always blowing, there's always some lightning and some hail and so forth and so on. But you and I are so different, said Pink. How come? That only proves what I'm saying, cried Yellow. It's all accidental. You're probably a different kind of wood. You must have rolled down a different kind of hill, a soft, mushy one, perhaps. Pink was not satisfied with these explanations. He suddenly gave Yellow a challenging look. "Explain this," he said. "How come we're painted the way we are?" Yellow took a few circular turns, pondering this question. "The paint," he muttered, "the paint. Well, suppose when we rolled down those hills, or whatever it was we rolled down, we rolled through some paint someone had spilled. Pink for you, and yellow for me." "And it came out so neat and symmetrical," Pink said, "with perfect edges in just the right places. There were 3 drops of white paint in a straight line for my buttons and 3 black drops for yours. What about that, my yellow friend?" Yellow was silent. He leaned against a tree stump, scratching his wooden head. "I can't answer all the questions," he said finally. "Some things will just have to remain a mystery. Maybe forever. But why are we arguing on such a fine day?" Just then a man who needed a haircut came shambling along, humming out of tune. He picked up Pink and looked him over. Then he picked up Yellow and looked him over. "Nice and dry," he said. He tucked them both under his arm and headed back where he'd come from. "Who's this guy?" Yellow whispered in Pink's ear. Pink didn't know. So Yellow has just a hard time explaining how it's all accidental, as anyone who wants to claim God does. And it's going to be interesting as we go through the God folks. So here I'm primarily going to refer to Anselm, and that excerpt is on page 345, and Aquinas, who immediately follows Anselm. And then we're going to kind of shift a little bit and talk about Pascal and Kierkegaard, and they're doing a different type of proof for the existence of God. Then we're going to turn toward Nietzsche, who presumes that there isn't a God, that God is dead, and we'll get there. And then Russell, who doesn't believe that God as an entity exists, but loves the idea of the concept of God. So that's going to be very interesting when we turn to Bertrand Russell. And that'll be, I'll do the God folks this week, and then for next week, then I'll do the non-God folks, and then I'll basically close out the class. So it'll be interesting then when reading these, thinking about who the audience is. Who are these authors writing these for? Are they writing these for fellow God believers? Hey, look, here's more justification for you, some confirmation bias here. Are they writing them for the atheist, who doesn't believe the entity exists? And so these authors are trying to bring the atheist into the fold of believers. Or maybe the agnostic, who just doesn't know, who's looking for that answer. Like, gee, is there one or isn't there one? I'd really like to know. It's going to be interesting. Anselm, I think, is writing primarily to the atheist. Okay? And so Anselm's argument is going to be very, very simple. There's only going to be 2 premises, followed by the conclusion, therefore God exists. And this will sound somewhat familiar to us, because Descartes uses it for his proof for the existence of God, which then is the beginning of his rebuild project for knowledge. Anselm says, okay, premise number 1. When I say God, even to the atheist, heck, even to the agnostic, though Anselm doesn't specifically reference them, when I say God to anyone, it's not like I'm making that word up. Notice, he's disagreeing then with Carnap, who's going to come about 900 years later. Carnap says God is like Tevi. I say God, I mean one thing. You say God, you mean something else. Anselm says, look, regardless of the differences between what I mean when I say it and what you mean when you say it, we can all agree, everybody understands the concept of God at least includes the greatest thought. That thing than which nothing greater can be thought or conceived. God's the greatest concept. Okay. Then where we disagree then is the God believer thinks that that entity actually exists in reality. The atheist thinks that entity doesn't actually exist in reality. There's the disagreement. That's it. And then the agnostic just doesn't know whether that entity exists in reality or not. But we all agree as to what we mean when we say God. Again, this is question 1, not question 2. We're not getting into specifics about the Islamic God Allah or the Hebrew God Yahweh or the Christian God, Jesus, or Holy Spirit, or Jehovah, or any of those. We're not talking about the God Brahma of Hinduism. We're not talking about any specific God that has any specific role other than the greatest thought. All right? It's premise one. God is the greatest thought. Two, things are greater if they exist in reality rather than merely in the mind. So imagine you're really hungry. You're not starving. You're really, really hungry. And you think about your favorite food. Does that help to satiate your hunger pains? No. What helps to satiate your hunger pains is actual real food. Real food is better than imagined food when it comes to things like hunger. So if God's the greatest thought, and everything is greater if it exists in reality rather than merely as a thought, therefore, God must exist in reality. If God didn't exist in reality, then we could all conceive of something greater. Namely, that great idea in reality. Existence purely conceptual rather than in reality is a flaw. It's a weakness. It's a lacking. Therefore, not the greatest thought anymore. Very rationalist way of trying to get to the proof of God. Notice how intellectual it is. It's all about the mind. It's not really about existence out there. It really doesn't talk about out there much at all, except only in passing in the second premise. Better to exist out there than merely in here. But we're not looking at reality necessarily. We're not looking at existence itself to prove the existence of God. Now, if you have an issue with the conclusion that God exists, or an issue with the argument generally speaking, then you've got to find where the weak point is of the argument. You might think it's the first premise. God is greatest thought. Well, couldn't I just conceive of any great thought, and therefore it must exist in reality? No. This is the greatest thought, not just a great thought. Unicorns are a great thought. Leprechauns are a great thought. They're not the greatest thought. And notice, too, if we want to go just one step further, this greatest thought, this greatest thing, does kind of take the place of God, right? I mean, if you believe that society is the greatest thing, then think about the things that you will do on behalf of society itself. You may make sacrifices on behalf of society. You may devote particular things such as money or time to the greatness of this society. Or if you think family is the greatest thing, then you're going to make certain sacrifices. Right? God's that thing for which you sacrifice. So that's not the weak point. The weak point is premise number 2. It's one thing to speak about imagined pupusas versus in reality. It's one thing to think about imagined pizza versus actual pizza. Let's think about art. My artsy friends, frequently, their idea, their concept, what they have up here is superior to the thing that they actually produce. The thing that they produce never quite reaches the concept. The concept is greater than the thing in reality. And so if there are at least a few instances where a concept is greater than reality, then the second premise of Anselm's argument gets called into question. And if you call into question either one of the two premises, it calls the conclusion into question. Some have claimed Anselm at best, proves the existence of the concept of God, but really doesn't prove God's existence out there in reality anywhere. that maybe this is like Tevi. When I say God, what I've done is I've expressed a certain psychological image with that term, right? I've expressed more about myself than I have any entity out there called God. Jacques Derrida, amongst others, and some sciences back this up, some research and so forth, that really when I say God, what I'm really telling you is what my biological father is like. So if I can conceive of God as being all-powerful, then perhaps my biological father was this strong individual. Maybe he wasn't around very much, but he provided, he took care of. Or if I don't believe that God exists, perhaps that's because my own biological father abandoned me. He wasn't around. He didn't demonstrate love to me. I had no proof of his existence in reality. It was just kind of this conceptual thing that I heard people talk about. Maybe. What's also interesting, and so I said that Descartes was kind of piggybacking off of Anselm here. Remember, Descartes said we all have a concept of infinite and a concept of perfect. Where could it come from? Not from us. We're neither infinite nor perfect, therefore God. Right? We remember that deal. Anselm doesn't say it quite that way, but this whole notion of greatest thought, think about the two different yet related definitions of greatness. If something is great, it could be great, as in great big, as in grand in scale, huge, massive, let's say infinitely large. I could also, when I say something is great, mean it's fantastic. Mean it's, ooh, boy, really, really good. It's, maybe close to perfect. Right? No one's perfect, and what we mean when we say that is things like ethically perfect. But boy, this person's a great person. We don't mean they're massive in size. We mean they make ethical decisions more frequently than they don't. They're a good role model. They're a good person that we should all try to be like. They're great. And so we get things like infinity. We get things like perfection, especially with regards to things like ethics. Now, the ethical proof of the existence of God is complete garbage. We're not even going to talk about that one. And if you want Schrappe's discussion on how garbage that is, take my ethics class. Okay, that happens in about week 2 or 3 of my ethics class. So we're not even going to talk about that one. Anselm, God's the greatest thought. Right, atheist? You agree God's the greatest thought, right? Then you've also got to go ahead and agree that God must exist in reality, because otherwise this greatest thought wouldn't be that great after all. There'd be a thought that was greater. Haha, gotcha, atheist. Yay, see you on Sunday. Or Saturday, or Friday, or whatever day. What's interesting then is Aquinas, and that's it for Anselm. That's it. And either you buy the two premises and therefore the conclusion, or you don't. And so one question to perhaps ask yourself as we go through this section of the course, if you are an atheist, and I'm not saying you need to declare yourself as such or anything along those lines, but if you are an atheist, think, okay, did this argument convince me that God exists? And if you're a God believer, ask yourself, would I use this one to try to convince an atheist? And if you're an agnostic, think, did this sway me over to the God side? Because that's ultimately the test that all of these theories, that all of these arguments are going to have to go through, right? That's what they're trying to do. They're trying to prove the existence of God, so either they succeed or they fail. Either they succeed in proving the conclusion, therefore God exists, or they don't. Think again about the court of law. These are the prosecuting attorneys. Either they've demonstrated conclusively, beyond a reasonable amount of doubt, perhaps not beyond all doubt, but beyond a reasonable amount of doubt, that the defendant is guilty. These folks are trying to prove beyond a reasonable amount of doubt that God exists. Therefore, guilty. The prosecution has done its job adequately. Or it's fallen short, and they have not demonstrated that the defendant is guilty. They have not proven the conclusion. Therefore, the conclusion is called into question. Therefore, we're still stuck with, maybe God. So that's Anselm. Then Aquinas comes along a couple of hundred years later, and Aquinas is a fellow God believer, but thinks that Anselm went about it in completely the wrong way. Anselm went about it way too rationally, way too platonically. Aquinas is heavily influenced by Aristotle, okay? And Aquinas is kind of the philosophical father or grandfather or whatever patriarch you want to use here for the Catholic Church. And there's a lot of parallels between Catholicism and Aristotelian thought. There's also a lot of parallels between Aristotelian thought and Islam. Because again, I think I mentioned this previously, during the time period when Islam was at its greatest rise, Aristotle was the philosopher of the day. And so most Muslim philosophers are drawing upon Aristotle much more so than Plato. And Aquinas is writing right around that same time period. Not that he's Muslim, he happens to be Catholic instead, but there's a lot of similarities, at least philosophically. Maybe not when it comes to practical application, perhaps not when it comes to actual practicing of the belief, or of the faith. But philosophically, there's a lot of agreement, because they're both drawing from Aristotle. So Aquinas comes along, he's like, look, Aristotle even said there's got to be something at the beginning, right? None of us were there, we don't know, but we can make a best guess, because if we look around us now, we see things like cause and effect. Every effect has a cause. That cause was an effect from a previous cause. That was an effect from a previous cause, and trace it on back. Now, you can't trace it back ad infinitum. There had to be a beginning at some point in time, something that was the first cause, an uncaused causer. Same deal with motion. Motion is real. Every action, more so than opposite and equal reaction, has some type of proaction. That there had to be an action which preceded it, an action which caused that thing to occur. Just like cause and effect can't go back forever and ever, there had to be a starting point. Same deal with motion. There had to have been something which got motion started, something which itself was not moved, but moved everything else, the unmoved mover. And those are two of Aquinas' arguments for the existence of God. Aquinas gives 5. It's unclear if we need all 5 of these together, if this is like, if you get enough circumstantial evidence, then that proves it, or if we need just a couple of these, or hey, pick the one that speaks to you and go with it. Aquinas is unclear on that, but he gives us 5, and 2 of them are straight from Aristotle. Unmoved mover, uncaused causer. The third one's going to be really, really closely related, just slightly different language being used. He's going to talk about necessity and possibility. So this is on page 350. The third way is taken from possibility and necessity and goes as follows. We come across some things which are merely possibles. They can both be and not be. Things like us. For example, we find some things coming into being and passing away. Again, us. We come into being, we pass away. We are therefore only possible, not necessary. And hence, having the possibility of being and not being. But it is impossible for everything there is to be of this sort. Since if something has the possibility of not being, then at some time or other, it lacks being. Right? If it's coming into being, then there was a point in time prior to its coming into being. Time was still there, time was still real, other things existed prior to my existence. And actually, if you go back to the Dewey postulate of immediate empiricism, even he talks about this as well. It says, look, we presume stuff existed before we did. We don't have great evidence to support it, but we presume it to be the case. And it's towards the end of the postulate of immediate empiricism article. So if all things have the possibility of not being, at some time then there was nothing at all. But if this were the case, then there would still be nothing now, since what lacks being does not begin to be except through something which is. Right? I came into being because prior to my existence were my parents. My parents existed, then, bam, I existed. Prior to their existence were their parents. Trace that on back. At some point in time, there had to be a first. There had to be a beginning. There had to be something which is necessarily the case in order for all of these possible things to therefore be the case. There must be something in the world which is necessary. Call a God. The necessary thing that was there before all of these possible things came into being and passed out of existence. So again, this is a tracing back. This is a looking at the state of the situation now, looking at science now and tracing it back. There had to be a beginning. What I think is interesting is if you talk to scientists and read science books and so forth, they say things like energy can neither be created nor destroyed. What about the beginning, when and wherever that was and wherever that looked like? Didn't energy have to be created at some point? Just a thought. All right. Let me move on to the fourth one. And Aquinas is so good here, because this fourth one is going to be just like Anselm's argument. So remember, he's against Anselm's argument because it's too rationalist, not empirical enough. So these first three are very empirical. This fourth one now is much more rationalistic than it is empirical, but he's buried it, right? Think about a good music set, for instance. You start with the great stuff, you end with the great stuff everybody knows. If you have something new that you're not sure if it's good or not, you bury it in the middle, because everyone will forget it anyway. They'll remember the first stuff and the last stuff and forget the stuff in the middle. Same here if you're presenting an argument. If you're a prosecuting attorney, you lead with the strong stuff, you close with the strong stuff, the weak stuff you bury in the middle. So he's going to bury the Platonic explanation in with all of these other Aristotelian ones. And he's actually going to quote Aristotle. He's taking Aristotle out of context, but he is quoting Aristotle, which is meant to further throw you off the trail. Plato, what are you talking about? I'm quoting Aristotle here. Okay. The fourth way is taken from the gradations to be found in things. We come across some things which are more or less good or true or noble than others, and so on. Notice this is a reference to Plato's forms. There's a form of beauty. This thing's closer to it. This thing's further away from it. There's a form of goodness. This thing's closer to it. This thing's further away from it. There's a form out there. Just replace form with God. The most noble, the most true, the most beautiful. God. Hence, there is something which is the cause of being and goodness and every other perfection in things. We call this God. Notice this truest, noblest, most beautiful, most good, perfect, is one meaning of great, to go back to Anselm. Interesting. Then the fifth one is basically intelligent design. The fifth way is taken from the manner in which things are directed or guided. We see some things that lack knowledge, things like acorns, natural bodies, working for the sake of a goal or an end. This is clear from the fact that they always or often act in the same way to pursue what is best, and this shows that they reach their goal not by chance but from directedness. Acorns will turn into trees or squirrel food. The end. That's what happens to acorns. Acorns can't suddenly decide for themselves, I'm going to become a mountain lion. No, because they don't have knowledge. They can't make decisions. And yet, every acorn turns into a tree or squirrel food, that can't be mere coincidence. There has to be someone or something directing them, deciding on their behalf that acorns will become trees or squirrel food and not mountain lions. They must be designed by someone or something that is intelligent, such that they will always become trees or squirrel food. They have a certain goal or end that always comes about. They can't decide otherwise. He equates it to an archer and an arrow. Things which do not have knowledge do not tend toward a goal unless they're guided by something with knowledge and intelligence, as an arrow is by the archer. The arrow doesn't decide where to go. The archer decides where the arrow goes. There's a directedness. There's an end that the arrow is getting to, and it's based upon the archer. Not halfway through the arrow is like, I'm going to go left now. That doesn't happen. Things that lack knowledge are directed by things that have knowledge. Trees don't suddenly decide to become tables. Something that's intelligent, us, we chop the trees down and turn them into tables. That's their end, because we've decided it for them, because they're not going to decide that on their own. Here's where this one gets a bit complicated. Aquinas is unclear whether we, thinking things, are arrows or archers. If we are arrows, just like acorns and trees and whatnot, then we are guided or directed by God, the only archer that there is. Which may mean we don't really have free will after all. Because we, like the arrow, can't suddenly decide to go left. There are some, then, who will claim that the purpose and meaning of life is to find that meaning and purpose that God has given us. So we can direct, towards the goal and the end point and all of that stuff. But even that implies some type of choice involved, like I, the arrow, can decide to go left or go straight, because that's the way the archer loosed me. The other direction, where archers, we decide for ourselves, we have our own goals and ends in view and so forth. Especially now with things like genetic modification, genetic engineering. Maybe we could go in there and tweak an acorn so it doesn't become a tree or squirrel food. Again, we're the ones that direct the trees when we chop them down and turn them into tables. And so if we're the archer, then we don't really need God after all. Maybe we needed God at some point. I mean, he intelligently designed acorns. That's nice. But now we're just as smart. And so we can go in there and manipulate stuff, and boom, look, now we have acorns turning into mountain lions, or something along those lines. That's an exaggeration, obviously, but you get the point. Right? Are we archers? Are we arrows? Are we some kind of weird in-between thing? I don't know. But the point here is not, are we archers or arrows? The point is that there are arrows, and that there is an archer that's not us. That we didn't intelligently design, at least in the beginning, acorns. There must have been something else that did, something with intelligence, namely God. And so Aquinas is trying to look at the world out there first, to prove the existence of God out there. Whereas Anselm looked in here to prove the existence of God out there. One's rationalist, one's empiricist. Plato, Aristotle. Even when it comes to the existence of God, we're back to Plato and Aristotle, thesis, antithesis. And so what'll be interesting then is in the next video, when I turn to Pascal, and I'll be referencing both excerpts from Pascal. And so for Pascal, it's pages... The Wager, page 356, and also at the end of the book, I believe it's like 750. 780, not 750, so 778, that excerpt. They're both from the same larger work, and so I'll be referencing both of them, going back and forth between those two excerpts. Pascal thinks Anselm and Aquinas are both wrong from the start, that their entire project is doomed to failure, because you can't prove the existence of God. He's going to do something quite a bit different. It's not actually going to be a proof. It's going to be something else. So when I talk about Pascal, I'll talk about his proof, in quotes, for the existence of God. And then Kierkegaard then builds sort of upon what Pascal is doing. So we'll see you next time.